your time has come. It will be all. Red blood from time blood.
Holy shit.
Close to the Sun is a first-person steampunk horror game where you play as Rose, who while searching for her sister, arrives on the Helios, a giant boat made by Nikolai Tesla. Atmosphere. The steampunk aesthetic is in full force. The large, ornate corridors and lavish decorations are constantly peppered with corpses, and to begin with, there's this sense of being watched. A dread forms in the early chapters since you don't know what's going on. There's some really great moody lighting and enough chaos in terms of the previous battles that went on in the halls of the Helios to really make you wonder what happened here, and the lack of information is tantalizing. Sadly, the game tries to hold on to this tension for way too long, and it kind of fails, with a lot of the early game chapters having little to no scares in them to sustain the atmosphere. It turns a tension-filled mystery into a walk in a museum, with the astoundingly well-designed surroundings completely stealing the show from the horror elements. Disappointingly, the more the game reveals itself, the less interesting it becomes, with some of the mid-game chapters being nothing more than predictable story points and walking around in ruined boiler rooms. The enemies that are present in the game are only there in very specific sequences, which makes the game's horror feel like it's being turned on and off like a tap, with nothing to worry about in the meantime. The later chapters ramp up the atmosphere a little with the story progression, but it's a bit too late by that point. The game is beautiful, it starts off strong, but it doesn't really have anything to keep itself going. That's no Harry Mason's. Scares. The game's scares either fall into chase sequences or jump scares. The jump scares are so sparse that they'll occasionally startle you, but it's sort of short-lived.
Ah! What the hell? Hey! Hey! Shit.
The chase sequences are all trial and error, and with an insta-killing enemy, this really doesn't do much to the scares and tends to frustrate more than anything, with each failure putting you back to try it again until you get it right. The most frightening parts of the game are actually dealing with electric machinery, which was hugely stress-inducing, with massive Tesla coils that shoot deadly electricity around the room and present you with narrow windows of opportunity to go and power it off by using the multiple control panels in the room. There were only 2 or 3 of these rooms at best in the whole game, and I felt my stomach drop each time I entered one. The final section of the game tries to use the same thing, but it feels more trial and error and features a chase sequence at the end, which was actually pretty intense. The deliberate scares are pretty disappointing. The most frightening things feel like a well-executed afterthought, and the finale is good, but it's only a few minutes long and comes right at the end of the game. Disappointingly, that's still no Harry Mason's. Sound design. There's not much music in the game besides some piano pieces and the slow orchestral backing tracks. The chase music hypes up the chases a bit, but again, due to the trial and error way those sequences play out, it's hard to appreciate them. The sound effects themselves are good, but have a habit of being a little too loud, and this doesn't seem to be able to be resolved by just adjusting the volumes, with explosions and cracking noises from the electric sparks being distorted due to the volume being too extreme. This isn't all the time, but when it does happen you can't help but notice it.
How's it going, Rosie? And what the devil is that terrible noise?
Yeah, about that. Could you unpower this lightning machine ahead of me?
Okay, I see what the problem is, but... Sorry, Rose, it isn't responding to my commands.
The ambience generally is very good, with things whirring and clicking in the background, humming and buzzing from machines, and the reverb is usually quite good. But there are some areas where the reverb environmental noises just seem stunted for some reason. There's just an eerie silence where it feels there should be something. The voice acting also has a tendency to be so loud that it peaks over the speaker limit and ends up distorted, with Aubrey's voice usually doing it the most thanks to the reverb on his voice lines. It's a bit disappointing, but otherwise the dialogue and the voice acting are generally very good.
You can't run from time, Rose! I'll have my revenge! You will pay for what you did!
You made it! Wow! What a sprint! I told you, Benny, she can run! Damn!
The reverb, as mentioned earlier, is a bit of hit or miss, but the directional audio works fine. Really, there's too many mixing and volume problems in this, even with some of the things being generally very good. That's still no Harry Masons. Gore. The gore in the game boils down to the huge number of bodies laying around in practically every area. It tries to point out the size of the massacre that took place if only Rose and the other survivors made it. But the corpses lose their impact after a while, with the numerous bodies just fading into the background due to them being literally everywhere. Though in a lot of the early scenes, especially in the interrogation room, it leaves quite the impact to find all the tools around the place used in barbaric process, and every now and then you'll see one particular body that stands out above all the others.
Oh, god damn it.
What's wrong?
There's... Ugh, gross. There's the body of a man crucified against the elevator wall. Is there a different elevator you can send up? I'd rather not.
It's the only one.
The death animations, especially to the antagonist Ludwig, are pretty gory, with Rose being stabbed multiple times with the screen turning red and blood splatters going everywhere. Even though the game has its trial and error chase sequences, and these don't get any easier to look at the more you see them. Whilst the bodies eventually stop being harrowing, the death animations and more well-designed scenes generally make up for it. That's one Harry Mason.
And yet still hungers for that other half.
Story. The game begins with Rose getting a boat to the Helios vessel and arriving on board to find no one around, a quarantine sign over the front door, and bodies everywhere. The setting is very grand with the brass and wood panels, and it's enough to make you forget that you're on a boat. It feels more like a large building, but the story doesn't really utilize this fantastical setting for much of anything, besides the obligatory sections of boat maintenance every game on a ship has.
This is Nikolai Tesla speaking, and unless it wasn't already obvious, this ship is under strict quarantine. There is to be no movement on or off the Helios, and yet, here you are. Another one of Edison's spies, I think. No matter. Movement throughout the ship has been restricted, whether you are friend or foe. Do watch your step.
The plot itself was an interesting concept that had a lot of predictable plot twists, with so many things telegraphing what was going to happen before it did, that made it a bit disappointing when things actually happened exactly as I thought they would. The game uses ghosts to emulate flashbacks, but I found a lot of them uninteresting. The game's climax felt quite big, with most of the interesting sections happening in a few short chapters towards the end of the game, but the actual ending left a lot to be desired for me personally, with a lot of things feeling like they were just unresolved. The game has access to historical figures like Nikolai Tesla, and invents a brilliant environment to stage the events of the game in, but it really doesn't feel like it uses them to do much of anything. Making the final score 1 out of 5 Harry Masons. Close to the Sun has a brilliant concept that it just doesn't really utilise whatsoever. The first 2 chapters of the game don't really have anything to keep the tense atmosphere going, and the 3rd chapter is punctuated with a frustrating chase sequence. The characters are quite well written, but their points in the story are contrived and feel predictable. And lastly, the scares are either boring, predictable, or just frustrating to deal with. It's a real shame. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion on horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.